The fluorescent lights of the bargain grocery store hummed a tired, buzzing dirge, casting a sickly yellow pallor over everything. For Thomas Hayes, the light felt personal, as if it were exposing the frayed cuffs of his jacket and the weary lines etched around his eyes. He stood at the checkout, his 6-year-old daughter Lily holding his hand, her small fingers a warm anchor in his sea of quiet desperation. On the conveyor belt sat their meager haul: a loaf of day-old bread, a small carton of milk, and a single, slightly bruised apple for Lily's lunch tomorrow. It wasn't much, but it was what he could afford. Or what he hoped he could afford. He slid his debit card into the chip reader, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He held his breath, praying. The machine beeped, a shrill, unforgiving sound. Declined. The word flashed in stark red letters on the small screen. A digital condemnation. A hot flush of shame crept up his neck. The cashier, a teenager with bored, accusing eyes, sighed with theatrical impatience. It didn't go through. I know. I saw, Thomas said, his voice barely a whisper. He fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a crumpled handful of bills and coins. He flattened them on the counter, his hands trembling slightly as he counted. $1, $2, $3, and a collection of dimes and nickels that amounted to less than another $1. Not enough. Not even close. The line behind him was growing, a restless beast of rustling bags and shuffling feet. A woman with a cart overflowing with organic produce and artisanal cheeses let out an audible huff. Then, a voice, smooth and sharp as polished granite, cut through the tense silence. Some people really should learn to manage their finances before breeding. Thomas's head snapped up. The voice belonged to Mr. Sterling, his landlord, a man who seemed sculpted from arrogance and tailored suits. He stood directly behind Thomas, his expensive leather shoes gleaming even under the store's jaundiced light. A cruel smirk played on his lips as he gestured vaguely at Thomas and Lily. It's a matter of public decency, really. Holding up responsible citizens. The cashier snickered. The woman behind Sterling nodded in sanctimonious agreement. Every eye was on Thomas, a specimen of failure pinned under the harsh glare of public judgment. The humiliation was a physical force, pressing down on his chest, stealing his breath. He could have argued, could have said something about his wife's medical bills, about the factory that closed down, about the sheer, grinding bad luck that had worn him down to this moment. But what was the point? To men like Sterling, explanations were just excuses. He looked down at Lily. Her big, brown eyes, so much like her mother's, were wide with confusion and hurt. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She understood the shame radiating from her father. That was the deepest cut of all. Swallowing the bitter taste of pride, Thomas slowly pushed the bread and milk back toward the cashier. I'm sorry, he mumbled to no one in particular. We don't need these today. He took Lily's hand, his grip a little too tight, and walked away from the counter, away from the smirking landlord and the pitying stares. As they pushed through the automatic doors and into the chilly evening air, Lily looked up at him, her small voice trembling. Daddy, are you sad? He forced a smile that felt like cracking glass. No, sweetie. I'm just thinking, but he was sad. He was hollowed out, a man made of shame and failure, walking into a world that had no place for him. The walk home was a march through a landscape of failure. The cracked pavement mirrored the fissures in his own life. Their apartment building, a rundown brick structure owned by Sterling Properties, loomed at the end of the street like a monument to his poverty. Taped to their door, stark white against the peeling brown paint, was the final insult. An official-looking document, its bold, black letters screaming at him from behind a plastic sleeve. Eviction notice. Thomas felt the last bit of air leave his lungs. He had known it was coming. The rent was 2 months past due, a chasm he had no way of bridging. But seeing it there, a formal declaration of his defeat, was like a punch to the gut. He gently steered Lily inside before she could see it, his hand shielding her eyes from the damning paper. Once inside the small, sparsely furnished apartment, he sank onto the lumpy sofa, The eviction notice crumpled in his fist. The legal jargon was cold and clinical, a stark contrast to the very human desperation it was causing. Failure to remit payment. Must vacate the premises within 72 hours. The words blurred. 72 hours. Felt like a death sentence. He looked around the room, at the water stains spreading across the ceiling, the window that wouldn't quite close, letting in a persistent draft. It wasn't much, but it was their home. It was the only home Lily had ever known. A surge of defiant anger, a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time, coursed through him. He wouldn't just be cast aside. He smoothed out the notice, found the number for Sterling Properties, and dialed, his fingers stiff. A crisp, dismissive female voice answered. Sterling Properties, how may I direct your call? I need to speak with Mr. Sterling, Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady. Mr. Sterling is in a meeting. May I take a message? It's about an eviction notice. 214 Elm Street. My name is Thomas Hayes. There was a pause, the clicking of a keyboard. Ah yes, Mr. Hayes. The message is the notice. Payment is due in full or the eviction proceeds. Mr. Sterling has been very clear on this. The secretary's voice was a perfect echo of her boss's condescension. Please, Thomas begged, the anger draining away, replaced by raw pleading. Just let me talk to him. I just need a little more time. I can get it. I just need an extension. A sigh of exasperation came through the line. Hold, please. After a moment, Sterling's slick, self-satisfied voice filled his ear. Hayes, you have a lot of nerve calling my office. The notice is self-explanatory. I'm running a business, not a charity. Mr. Sterling, I have a 6-year-old daughter, Thomas said, his voice cracking. I lost my job. My wife, she passed away. The medical bills. Everyone has a story. Hayes. Sterling cut him off, his tone dripping with disdain. Frankly, I don't care about yours. You signed a lease. You failed to uphold your end of the bargain. The world doesn't stop for personal tragedies. It's called responsibility. You have 72 hours. Don't make me have the sheriff drag you out. It's so unpleasant for the other tenants. The line went dead. Thomas sat there, the receiver pressed to his ear, listening to the dial tone's mocking hum. Sterling hadn't just denied him an extension. He had denied his humanity. He had reduced Thomas's entire life, his love and his loss, to a simple, inconvenient story he didn't care to hear. The world was not made for men like him. It was made for men like Sterling. Later that night, long after Lily was asleep in her small bed, Thomas sat in the darkness of the living room, the silence amplifying the frantic noise in his own head. He wasn't a failure. He knew that deep down. He was a man who had been hammered by fate, again and again. He closed his eyes and saw her face. Sarah. His Sarah. The scent of her favorite jasmine tea seemed to linger in the air, a ghost of a memory. He remembered the day she was diagnosed, the cold, sterile light of the doctor's office, the way she had squeezed his hand, her grip firm even as her world was collapsing. We'll fight this, Tom, she had said, her voice unwavering. Together, they did fight. They fought with everything they had. He worked 2 jobs, she endured grueling treatments. They sold their car, then their small house, pouring every penny into the voracious maw of the healthcare system. But it wasn't enough. The illness was relentless, and in the end, it took her. It left him with a mountain of debt and a hole in his heart the size of the sky. It also left him with Lily, a perfect, beautiful piece of Sarah that he swore he would protect with his life. Before all of that, before the illness and the loss, he had been a different man. Staff Sergeant Thomas Hayes, U.S. Army combat medic. He had served 2 tours, his hands trained to bring order to the chaos of the battlefield, to staunch bleeding, to set bones, to whisper words of calm to young men on the brink of death. He had seen the worst of humanity, but he had also seen the best. The courage, the sacrifice, the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood. He learned that a man's worth wasn't measured by the money in his bank account, but by the integrity in his heart and the resolve in his actions. When he left the service, He put that life behind him, wanting nothing more than quiet years with Sarah and a family. He never talked about it. It was a closed chapter. But the training, the discipline, the instinct to run toward trouble instead of away from it, that was etched into his soul. He looked at the single framed photo on the mantelpiece. A picture of him and Sarah on their wedding day, both of them young and luminous with hope. "I won't let her down, Sarah," he whispered into the empty room. "I promise." That promise was the bedrock of his quiet strength, the unyielding principle that would guide him even now, in his darkest hour. The next 48 hours were a blur of quiet panic. The eviction clock was ticking, a merciless metronome counting down the seconds to his family's homelessness. First thing in the morning, Thomas gathered the few things of value he had left. An old watch, a set of silver cufflinks his father had given him, and the last, most precious item, Sarah's locket. It was a simple gold oval, and inside was a tiny, faded picture of him and a newborn Lily. His fingers trembled as he held it. It was the last piece of her he had. Selling it felt like a betrayal, like carving out another piece of his own heart. But Lily's face, sleeping peacefully in the other room, gave him the strength he needed. He tucked it into his pocket and walked to the pawn shop on the other side of town. The shop smelled of dust and desperation. The owner, a man with weary eyes, examined the items with a practiced indifference. He offered a pittance for the watch and cufflinks. Then Thomas placed the locket on the glass counter. The owner picked it up, his expression softening for a fraction of a second as he opened it and saw the photo. He looked up at Thomas, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He gave him a slightly better price for it than he should have. It was still almost nothing. Thomas took the crumpled bills, the price of his most cherished memories, and walked out, feeling lighter and heavier all at once. The money in his pocket, a paltry sum, was a screaming reminder of how little he had. It was enough for a few days of food, maybe a night in a cheap motel. It was not a solution. It was a postponement of the inevitable. As he walked through the town square, he felt like a ghost. The town wasn't large. Gossip traveled fast. He saw Mrs. Gable from the church guild whisper to her friend as he passed, their eyes darting toward him with a mixture of pity and judgment. He saw parents from Lily's school pull their children a little closer, as if his poverty were a contagious disease. Their silence was worse than Sterling's open contempt. It was a quiet, collective turning of the back, a communal decision that he was no longer one of them. He was other. He was a problem they preferred to ignore. He hurried past, his gaze fixed on the ground, the weight of their judgment pressing down on his shoulders. Back in his apartment, he saw a drawing Lily had taped to the refrigerator. It was a crayon picture of their family. A tall stick figure for him, a small one for her holding his hand, and floating above them a smiling figure with wings. "Mommy is our angel," Lily had told him proudly when she gave it to him. He touched the drawing, his finger tracing the lopsided halo. The pressure in his chest was immense, a physical pain. He was failing them both. The 72 hours were almost up, and he had nothing. The sky opened up as he was walking back from a final, fruitless attempt to find day labor work. A cold, miserable rain began to fall, soaking his thin jacket in seconds. He clutched the small wad of cash from the pawn shop in his pocket, the paper growing damp. It was his last shield against the world, and it was dissolving. The street lights blurred into halos of shimmering water. Then he heard it, not the rumble of thunder, but a sound far more violent. The high-pitched screech of tires desperately trying to find purchase on wet asphalt, followed by a sickening percussive crunch of metal and glass. He looked up just in time to see the aftermath. A sleek sedan, its driver, a teenager face illuminated by the glow of a phone, had blown through a red light and T-boned a motorcycle in the middle of the intersection. The impact was brutal. The bike was obliterated, a twisted wreck. The rider was thrown 20 feet through the air, a ragdoll in black leather, landing in a crumpled heap near the curb. A collective gasp rose from the few pedestrians huddled under awnings. People pulled out their phones, the blue light of their screens eerie in the twilight. They were filming, documenting, But no one was moving. Thomas didn't think. He acted. The combat medic inside him, dormant for years, roared to life. He broke into a sprint, his worn boots splashing through puddles, his heart pounding with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. He reached the fallen biker in seconds. It was a young man no older than 20. He was unconscious, his helmet cracked. Blood was everywhere. A shard of bone protruded from the denim of his jeans. A nasty compound fracture. But that wasn't the immediate threat. Thomas's trained eyes saw the rhythmic, arterial spurt of blood soaking the kid's thigh. Femoral artery. He had minutes, maybe less. "Somebody call 911, he yelled, his voice a commander's bark that cut through the stunned silence. "Tell them possible femoral bleed, compound fracture of the right femur, and head trauma." He knelt in the street, the grimy water soaking his knees. He ripped off his own jacket, the one he'd been trying to shield from the rain moments before, and tore a long, thick strip from the sleeve. Without hesitation, he wrapped it high and tight on the young man's thigh, finding the pressure point with an instinct born of battlefield experience. He twisted the fabric, using a piece of debris from the crash as a windlass to create a makeshift tourniquet. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. The young biker groaned, his eyelids fluttering. Hey, look at me," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a calm, reassuring tone. "Stay with me. What's your name?" "Leo?" the kid rasped, his eyes wide with pain and fear. "Okay, Leo. You're going to be all right. I'm not going to leave you." Thomas looked up and saw a small pharmacy on the corner, its lights a beacon. He pulled the damp wad of cash from his pocket, the locket money, Sarah's memory, and thrust it at a wide-eyed woman who had crept closer. "Go in there," he commanded. "Buy the biggest bottle of antiseptic and all the gauze pads they have. Tell them to keep the change." She stared at him, then at the money, then back at his determined face, and ran to do as he asked. He had just spent his last dollar, the final vestige of his past, on a stranger. In that moment it didn't matter. All that mattered was the life flickering in front of him. The wail of sirens grew closer, a welcome sound in the rain-slicked street. The paramedics, 2 seasoned professionals, rushed over with their gear. They stopped for a second, taking in the scene. The perfectly applied tourniquet, the calm man kneeling in the middle of the chaos, speaking in low tones to the injured biker. One of the paramedics, a burly man named Dave, knelt beside Thomas. "Nice work," he said, his eyes assessing the tourniquet. "You definitely bought him some time. That's a textbook application. Just did what needed to be done," Thomas replied, finally getting to his feet, his body aching. His hands were covered in blood. "You saved his leg, maybe his life," the other paramedic added, as they efficiently loaded Leo onto a gurney. "Where did you learn to do that?" Thomas just shook his head, looking down at his ruined jacket and empty hands. A long time ago he didn't offer his name, didn't seek any credit. He started to fade back into the small crowd that had gathered, his role in the drama complete. The people who had been filming now lowered their phones. Their expressions changed. The detached curiosity was gone, replaced by a quiet, grudging respect. They weren't looking at a failure anymore. They were looking at a hero. Mr. Sterling's luxury sedan happened to cruise past the intersection, slowing for the flashing lights. He glanced at the scene with annoyance, seeing the wrecked motorcycle and the ambulance. "More biker trash," he muttered to himself, shaking his head at the inconvenience. He didn't even notice the tall, soaked figure in the crowd, the very man he was so eager to throw out onto the street. As they loaded Leo into the ambulance, the young biker's eyes searched the crowd. They found Thomas. Even through the pain and the fog of shock, there was a profound, desperate gratitude in his gaze. "Thank you," he mouthed, his voice too weak to carry. "My name." Leo. Thomas gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. The ambulance doors closed, and it sped away, its sirens screaming into the night, leaving Thomas standing alone in the rain, with nothing but the clothes on his back and the quiet satisfaction of a life saved. The whispers had changed. A murmur went through the crowd as the woman from the pharmacy told everyone how he'd given her his last dollar. The shift was imperceptible, like the turning of a tide far out at sea, but it had begun. The next morning, the final morning, dawned gray and hopeless. The rain had stopped, but the sky was a blanket of damp concrete. The 72 hours were up. Thomas moved through the apartment like a ghost, methodically placing his and Lily's few possessions into cardboard boxes scavenged from behind the grocery store. Each item, a chipped mug, a well-loved storybook, Lily's collection of smooth stones, was a relic of a life about to be dismantled. Lily sat on the floor, watching him, her favorite teddy bear clutched in her arms. "Where are we going, Daddy?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "On an adventure, sweetie," he lied, his heart twisting. He didn't know where they were going. A shelter, maybe. A night in the car he no longer owned. The future was a terrifying, formless void. He was taping up the last box when he heard it. A low, distant rumble. At first he thought it was thunder, a return of the storm. But it didn't fade. It grew, a steady, deep-throated growl that seemed to vibrate up through the soles of his feet. He went to the window, the one that didn't close properly, and peered out. What he saw made him freeze. It was a river of steel, chrome, and black leather flowing down his narrow residential street. One motorcycle, then 10, then 50, then 100. They kept coming, an endless procession of Harleys. Their engines a synchronized, deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the building. They were Hell's Angels. Their vests were emblazoned with the iconic Death's Head patch, a symbol that struck fear and awe into the hearts of most people. They moved with a disciplined precision, parking in perfect, staggered formation, blocking the entire street from end to end. An army had just occupied Elm Street. Windows and doors up and down the block opened a crack. Neighbors, the same ones who had judged him with their silent stares, now peered out with wide, terrified eyes. Just then, a black sedan pulled up, blocked by the wall of motorcycles. Mr. Sterling got out, his face a mask of indignation, followed by a nervous-looking sheriff's deputy. "What is the meaning of this?" Sterling barked, striding toward the nearest biker. "I have an eviction to enforce. Clear the street." The biker, a mountain of a man with a long, graying beard, didn't even flinch. He just stared back, his expression unreadable. Sterling and the deputy stopped dead, their blustering authority evaporating in the face of this silent, immovable wall of leather and muscle. Then, as one, the bikers killed their engines. The sudden, profound silence was even more intimidating than the noise. They dismounted, 100, 200 men, and just stood there, their collective presence a powerful, unspoken statement. They weren't here to cause trouble. They were here to make a point. From the center of the formation, one man emerged. He was older than the rest, his face a roadmap of hard-lived years, but he walked with an undeniable authority. On his vest, above the club patch, was a smaller patch that read Preacher. He walked past the sputtering, impotent landlord and the unnerved deputy as if they were invisible. He walked right up to the door of apartment 2B and knocked, 3 firm, respectful raps. Thomas, his heart hammering against his ribs, opened the door. He braced himself, expecting a confrontation, a misunderstanding, a threat. The man in front of him was the embodiment of everything society taught him to fear. Preacher looked him up and down, his gaze missing nothing. The packed boxes, the weary lines on Thomas's face, the protective way he stood in the doorway, shielding Lily from view. "Are you Thomas Hayes?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, devoid of menace. Thomas swallowed, his throat dry. He could only manage a nod. "My name is Preacher," the man said. "I'm the president of this club. My son, Leo, he asked us to find you." A wave of understanding washed over Thomas. "Leo, the young biker from the accident. He told us what you did," Preacher continued, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "He said you were some kind of angel who fell out of the rain. Said you saved his life." Before Thomas could respond, Another man stepped forward. It was Dave, the paramedic from the accident scene. He wore a faded army jacket over a club t-shirt. "Preacher's an old army brother," Dave explained, nodding at Thomas. "When I heard the name of the kid you saved, I made a call. I told him the whole story. How you knew exactly what to do. How you used your own jacket for a tourniquet. How you spent your last dollar on medical supplies for a stranger." Then, another biker, a large man with tattoos covering his arms, spoke up from the crowd. "I'm the guy who runs the pawn shop downtown," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "This man came in 2 days ago, sold his wife's locket. Looked like it was tearing his heart out to do it. I saw the picture inside. A man doesn't do that unless he's desperate, and doing it for his kid." The pieces of Thomas's story, the parts he kept hidden and the parts he was ashamed of, were being laid bare for everyone to see. Not as evidence of his failure, but as testaments to his character. His quiet dignity, his hidden skills, his selfless sacrifice. It was all coming to light, not from his own mouth, but from the mouths of others. The entire street, the silent neighbors, the stunned landlord, the conflicted deputy, were all witnesses. Preacher's gaze shifted from Thomas and landed squarely on Mr. Sterling, who had been listening with a growing sense of dread. The biker president took 2 slow steps toward the landlord, his sheer presence making Sterling flinch and take a step back. "This man," Preacher said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl as he gestured back toward Thomas, "is under our protection now." He turned back to Thomas, pulling a thick, white envelope from inside his leather vest and pressing it into his hand. "His rent is paid." For the year, Thomas looked down at the envelope, stunned into silence. It was heavy with cash. "And you?" Preacher said, turning his full, menacing attention back to Sterling. The landlord visibly trembled. "You will never bother this man or his daughter again. Am I clear?" Sterling nodded frantically, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Good," Preacher continued, his voice like grinding stone. "Because we also noticed this building is a piece of crap. This man is raising his daughter here. He deserves better. You're going to fix it. New windows. Fix the plumbing. A new coat of paint. On your dime. We'll be checking your progress." Regularly, the deputy, seeing the direction this was going, suddenly found something very interesting to look at on the far side of the street, making it clear he would not be intervening. The confrontation over, the bikers' focus shifted. It was like watching a disciplined unit receive new orders. They moved past Thomas into his apartment, not with menace, but with purpose. "Don't worry, brother," one said, clapping him gently on the shoulder. "We'll have you sorted." They began unpacking his boxes, placing the items back on the shelves with surprising care. A few of them, clearly skilled craftsmen, immediately went to work. One started fixing the leaky faucet in the kitchen with tools from his saddlebag. Another began expertly patching the hole in the wall. A giant of a man with a skull tattooed on his neck and a surprisingly gentle smile knelt down to Lily, who was watching the whole scene with wide, unafraid eyes. He presented her with a small teddy bear, identical to her own, but this one was wearing a miniature, custom-made leather vest. Lily giggled and hugged it tightly. Bags of groceries appeared as if from nowhere, filling the empty cupboards and refrigerator. Finally, Preacher approached Thomas again. He held out a clean, folded black t-shirt. On the back, it had the club's name and location, a support shirt given only to trusted friends and family of the club. It wasn't a patch, not membership, but it was a powerful symbol of affiliation and belonging. "Your family now, Tom," Preacher said, using his first name for the first time. "You have 200 brothers. You ever need anything, you know who we are." A week later, the apartment was unrecognizable. The walls were freshly painted a warm, cheerful yellow that Lily had picked out. A new, double-paned window kept out the chill, and the faucet in the kitchen sink no longer dripped its maddening, constant rhythm of decay. The refrigerator hummed, fully stocked with fresh food. The air, once thick with desperation, was now light with the sounds of Lily's laughter as she played on a new, brightly colored rug in the center of the living room. The transformation was not just physical. It was atmospheric. Hope had a scent, and it smelled like fresh paint and baking bread. Thomas stood by the window, watching his daughter play in the small courtyard below, which the bikers had cleaned of debris, and where they had planted a small flower bed. He wore a new, sturdy work jacket over the support shirt Preacher had given him. He felt its soft cotton against his skin, a constant, comforting reminder. Through their network, the bikers had found him a job. He was now the head of on-site security for a large construction firm run by a fellow veteran, a job that utilized his old skills and paid him a wage that was more than fair. He was no longer just surviving. He was building a life again. He heard the sound then, the familiar, low rumble of a Harley-Davidson engine. It wasn't the thunderous roar of a full pack this time, but the solitary growl of a single bike. He looked down at the street and saw Preacher, cruising by slowly on his gleaming motorcycle. He wasn't stopping, just passing through, a silent sentinel on his daily patrol. Their eyes met across the distance. Preacher gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of profound, mutual respect. Thomas nodded back, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. The warrior in him recognized the warrior in the other. The father in him thanked the father in the other. Preacher twisted the throttle, and the engine's rumble deepened as he continued down the street and disappeared around the corner. The sound no longer held any threat for Thomas. It had become a promise, a strange, powerful lullaby of loyalty and protection that now guarded his family's sleep. The neighbors, once so quick to judge, now greeted him with genuine smiles and waves. Mr. Sterling's contractors were busy, just as Preacher had commanded. Respect, Thomas realized, was a strange currency. He had never asked for it, never demanded it, and never thought he would have it again. But by holding on to his dignity when he had nothing else, by acting with honor in a moment of crisis, he had earned it in spades. He turned from the window and knelt, wrapping his arms around Lily, pulling her into a hug. She smelled like soap and childhood. He held her close, looking out at the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. A quiet man who had faced down the world and found his place, not through noise or aggression, but through the enduring strength of his own quiet heart. He was home, he was safe, and he was not alone.